The digital clock on the security monitor inside Elmwood Correctional Facility displayed 10:02 p.m., October 17th, documenting another quiet night shift winding down. Elmwood is a medium-security state prison situated on the outskirts of Oak Haven, Indiana, a town where the rhythm of life often feels dictated by the institutional presence of the facility itself. On this Tuesday evening, the usual hum of the building, the distant clanging of doors, and the low murmur of voices seemed to settle into a predictable pattern, a controlled environment where order was paramount. Officer David Miller, a 10-year veteran of the Indiana Department of Correction, was assigned to Block C, a routine post he had worked countless times. The surveillance cameras, mounted high in the corridors, offered a dispassionate, unblinking eye on every movement, every interaction, every moment within the concrete and steel structure. This footage, typically reviewed for procedural compliance or minor disturbances, would soon become central to understanding the events of that night. The night began without incident. Officer Miller completed his initial rounds, checking cell doors, observing inmates through the small windows, and logging his movements into the digital system. His demeanor, captured clearly by the corridor cameras, was professional and unassuming. He moved with the familiar gait of someone comfortable in their environment, his posture relaxed yet attentive. Other officers on duty that night reported nothing unusual about Miller's behavior. He exchanged routine pleasantries, discussed the mundane details of their shifts, and appeared outwardly entirely normal. Yet the seemingly ordinary facade would soon begin to fracture, revealing a hidden tension beneath the surface. The strictures of the prison, designed to contain those within, inadvertently also contained the volatile complexities of those who worked its corridors. The relentless scrutiny of the surveillance system, a tool intended for inmate control and staff safety, would ultimately expose not a planned escape or a routine altercation, but something far more personal, and ultimately far more devastating. The narrative of that night would shift from one of quiet control to one of desperate, fatal improvisation. The first subtle hint, almost imperceptible in the vast amount of footage, was a slight hesitation in Miller's step as he approached cell C-21-4. A cell occupied by inmate Thomas Jenkins. Thomas Jenkins had been incarcerated at Elmwood for the past 2 years, serving a sentence for nonviolent offenses. His record inside the facility was unremarkable. No major disciplinary issues, no history of conflict with staff or other inmates. He kept to himself, spent time reading, and occasionally worked in the prison laundry. By all accounts from fellow inmates and officers who interacted with him casually, he was quiet and posed no significant threat. His cell, C-21-4, was small, sparse, containing only the standard issue bunk, a desk and a small shelf of books. The routine for inmates in Block C at this hour was locked down, doors secured, lights dimmed, preparation for sleep. Jenkins, like the others, should have been in his cell, settled for the night. But the surveillance footage from the camera covering the corridor leading to C Block showed Officer Miller deviating slightly from his prescribed path around town. Instead of continuing his rounds towards the end of the block, he paused near the door to a small, infrequently used storage closet located just down the hall from Jenkins' cell. The camera captured him glancing up and down the empty corridor before quickly stepping inside the closet. This brief, almost furtive action, lasting only seconds, was the first anomaly in what had otherwise been a perfectly standard shift. Inside the storage closet, out of the primary view of the main corridor cameras, Officer Miller engaged in an action that would later form a critical piece of evidence. While the angle was partially obscured by the doorframe, forensic analysis of the pixelation and timestamps confirmed that Miller accessed his personal mobile phone, which was strictly prohibited on the prison floor. The light from the screen was faintly visible in the dim confines of the closet. The duration of this activity was short, less than a minute, but its significance was immense. This unauthorized use of a personal device suggested a communication that could not or would not be conducted through official channels. When Miller emerged from the closet, his expression, as captured by the hallway camera, showed a subtle shift. The neutral professional mask seemed to tighten almost imperceptibly. He resumed his rounds, but the earlier fluid motion was replaced by a slightly more rigid stride. His gaze seemed less observational and more focused, directed perhaps by something external to the immediate environment of the corridor. The silence of the prison night felt more profound now, punctuated only by the echo of his footsteps. The events of the next few minutes would unfold with a chilling swiftness, captured entirely by the silent, digital witnesses mounted above. Just before 10:20 p.m., The surveillance footage documented Officer Miller approaching cell C-21-4. He stopped directly in front of the door. This was not unusual. Officers frequently paused at cell doors during rounds. What was unusual was the subsequent interaction. Instead of simply glancing inside or continuing on, Miller appeared to speak to someone inside the cell. His head was angled towards the small window, and his lips moved. The camera captured Jenkins appearing at the window from the inside. There was a brief, low-voiced exchange. The audio from the camera feed, though muffled by the thick steel door, later underwent extensive analysis. While the initial words were indistinct, forensic audio experts were able to isolate certain frequencies and patterns that suggested the tone of the conversation shifted rapidly. It began quietly, a private communication between officer and inmate, a violation of protocol in itself. But the tone quickly escalated. Miller's posture stiffened, and his hand clenched at his side, an action not visible on camera but inferred from the tension in his shoulders. Jenkins' reaction inside the cell, though mostly obscured, appeared agitated. The routine observation had turned into a direct, high-stakes confrontation, the nature of which remained, at that moment, hidden behind the steel door. The camera continued to record, capturing the officer's increasingly tense stance outside the cell. The crucial moments unfolded rapidly after the brief, escalating exchange at the cell door. The surveillance footage showed Officer Miller taking a key from his belt, the jingle audible even on the muffled audio. He unlocked the door to cell C-21-4. This was a highly unusual action at this hour, during lockdown, without backup present or a documented emergency. Facility policy strictly prohibited unlocking inmate cells during nighttime lockdown, unless under specific circumstances requiring a supervisor's approval or in the presence of another officer. Miller was alone. The camera captured the heavy steel door swinging inward. The view into the cell was limited, but the figures of Miller and Jenkins could be seen moving within the small space. The muffled sounds from the audio feed became slightly clearer, revealing raised voices, though the specific words were still difficult to discern. There was a sudden burst of movement inside the cell, obscured by the doorway. The confrontation that had begun quietly outside the door had moved into the inmate's private space, away from the direct open view of the corridor camera, but still within its peripheral scope. What happened in the next few minutes would determine a life and shatter several others. The camera lens remained fixed, a silent, unblinking witness to the unfolding events within the cell. The struggle inside cell C-21-4 was brief and violent, though partially hidden from the main corridor camera's direct view. The footage captured distorted shapes and rapid motion within the cell's limited confines. The muffled audio recorded sounds of exertion, a grunt, a muffled cry, and then silence. Officer Miller emerged from the cell moments later. His uniform appeared slightly disheveled, and his face, captured by the camera as he turned back towards the corridor, was pale and strained. He quickly relocked the cell door. His movements were no longer fluid but jerky, driven by panic. He looked up and down the empty corridor frantically before composing himself slightly. He then resumed his rounds, attempting to project an air of normalcy. But the tension was palpable even through the grainy security footage. The duration from the moment Miller unlocked the cell door to when he relocked it was just under 3 minutes. 3 minutes that had contained a fatal confrontation. Inside cell C-2114, Thomas Jenkins lay dead. The camera continued to record the officer walking away, his silhouette receding down the long, sterile corridor. The silence of the prison night had returned, but it was no longer the predictable silence of routine. It was the heavy, unnatural silence that follows a violent act, a silence that would linger long after the immediate events had concluded. The body lay undiscovered for hours. The body of Thomas Jenkins was discovered during the routine morning count at 6:00 a.m. The following day, October 18th. Correctional officers conducting the count found him unresponsive in his cell. Emergency medical personnel were immediately called, but it was quickly determined that Jenkins was deceased. The scene inside cell C-2014 was not outwardly chaotic. The body was found on the floor near the bunk. However, a closer inspection by the initial responding officers noted ligature marks on Jenkins's neck, inconsistent with a natural death or suicide. The cell door was locked from the outside. The immediate assumption among early responders was a possible suicide using bedding or clothing, or perhaps an internal prison issue that had escalated during the night. Though the locked door complicated this, facility protocols for an in-custody death were initiated immediately. The prison was placed on a modified lockdown, and state police investigators were summoned to the scene to begin a forensic examination. The investigation initially proceeded with the standard thoroughness applied to any death within a correctional facility, examining the scene for evidence, interviewing staff and inmates, and reviewing logs. The crucial piece of evidence, the surveillance footage from Block C, was secured and sent for immediate review. The official investigation had begun, and it would quickly move beyond the initial assumptions. The state police investigation team arrived at Elmwood Correctional Facility within hours of the discovery. The scene inside cell C-24 was meticulously documented and processed. Forensic specialists collected physical evidence, took photographs, and sketched the scene. The initial findings from the medical examiner who performed a preliminary examination at the scene corroborated the presence of ligature marks, indicating strangulation. This immediately shifted the death from potentially natural or self-inflicted to homicide. The focus of the investigation narrowed considerably. How could an inmate be killed in his locked cell overnight? Who had access? The list of potential suspects within the controlled environment of the prison was limited primarily to staff who were on duty in Block C during the hours Jenkins was locked in his cell. Attention naturally turned to the officers working that block, specifically Officer David Miller, who was the primary officer assigned to C Block during the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. His logs showed nothing unusual. Routine checks completed, no reported disturbances. The paper trail, clean and in order, contradicted the emerging reality of a violent death. The discrepancy pointed directly towards deliberate deception. The review of the surveillance footage from Block C began almost immediately by a dedicated team of investigators. This is where the official narrative of the night began to unravel, piece by agonizing piece. The footage from 10:02 p.m. onwards was scrutinized frame by frame. The initial routine patrol was noted. Then came the anomaly. Officer Miller entering the storage closet at 10:15. The brief obscured action inside. His subsequent approach to C-2140 at 10:20 p.m. The conversation at the door. The sound of the key. The door unlocking. Miller entering the cell. The distorted view of the struggle inside. Miller emerging, locking the door. His visible distress. The timeline was clear, undeniable, and damning. The footage provided irrefutable evidence that Officer Miller was the last person to interact with Thomas Jenkins before his death, and that this interaction involved Miller entering Jenkins' cell, a direct violation of procedure that coincided precisely with the estimated time of death based on the initial medical examination. The video surveillance, intended as a tool for order and accountability, had instead documented a homicide committed by the very person tasked with maintaining safety. The neutral, digital eye had captured the truth behind the locked door. The investigation had its primary suspect, and the evidence against him appeared overwhelming. Confronted with the surveillance footage, Officer David Miller was brought in for questioning. Initially, he maintained his account of a routine shift, denying any unusual interactions with inmate Jenkins or anyone else. He claimed he had simply performed his standard checks and that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. However, when investigators presented him with specific timestamps from the video and described his actions, entering the storage closet, approaching C-21 at 10:20 p.m., unlocking the door, entering the cell, and emerging minutes later, his composure began to crack. The clinical detail of the video analysis, the cold, factual record of his movements, was impossible to dispute. The silent footage spoke with more authority than any denial. As the questioning continued, and faced with the irrefutable visual evidence, Miller's story changed. He admitted to going to Jenkins' cell, but initially claimed it was to address a minor disciplinary issue. This explanation did not align with the video showing him unlocking the door and entering the cell alone, or the audio suggesting an agitated conversation. Investigators pressed further, focusing on the personal phone use just minutes before the confrontation. The question shifted from how it happened to why. The motive remained the crucial missing piece. Investigators subpoenaed Officer Miller's personal phone records. The contents of the phone, once analyzed, painted a starkly different picture of David Miller's life than the professional facade he presented at Elmwood. The phone contained a large volume of text messages, emails, and call logs that revealed a secret, long-standing relationship with an individual outside the prison walls. The communications were intimate and passionate, detailing a complex emotional connection. However, the records also contained communications with Thomas Jenkins. These messages were not typical officer-inmate communications. They were brief, coded, and highly secretive. They suggested not disciplinary issues, but a different kind of relationship, one that also violated the clear boundaries and protocols of the correctional environment. The picture emerging was one of Miller living a double life, navigating personal relationships that were incompatible with his professional responsibilities, relationships that were now converging in a deadly manner. The motive, investigators began to suspect, lay hidden within the intricate and forbidden connections revealed by these digital breadcrumbs. The true nature of these relationships, and how they intersected with Thomas Jenkins, became the central focus of the investigation. The hidden world of personal secrets was colliding violently with the public world of institutional order. The investigation into Officer Miller's private communications revealed a profound and dangerous secret. For several months leading up to the night of October 17th, Officer Miller had been engaged in a secret, intimate relationship with Thomas Jenkins. This relationship was a gross violation of correctional policy, constituting a severe ethical breach and potential criminal conduct. The communications between Miller and Jenkins, recovered from Miller's phone, were explicit and detailed, leaving no doubt as to the nature of their connection. These messages, carefully catalogued and time-stamped by forensic analysts, established a clear timeline of the affair leading up to the fatal night. They showed a relationship that had become increasingly strained in the days prior to October. The reason for this strain became apparent through other communications found on Miller's phone. His primary secret relationship, the one outside the prison walls, was on the verge of being discovered. The woman he was involved with had found suspicious messages or behavior, and she was threatening to expose his affair with Jenkins. This external pressure created an untenable situation for Miller. His carefully constructed double life was about to collapse, bringing severe consequences for his career, his personal life, and potentially leading to criminal charges related to the relationship with an inmate. The pressure was mounting, and Miller felt trapped. The communication recovered from Officer Miller's phone sent just minutes before he entered the storage closet, and access to his phone was critical. It was a text message from the woman outside the prison walls. The content of the message, though not explicitly threatening in terms of physical harm, conveyed an ultimatum. She had evidence of his relationship with Jenkins, and intended to report him to the prison administration immediately, unless he severed all ties and somehow guaranteed her silence. The message set a deadline, just hours away. For Miller, facing the imminent exposure of his affair with Jenkins, the consequences were catastrophic: immediate termination, public disgrace, and potential felony charges. The message was sent at 10:14 p.m., minutes before he furtively checked his phone in the storage closet. This timing is crucial. It explains his agitated state and sudden deviation from routine. The stress and panic induced by this message, coupled with the immediate physical proximity of Thomas Jenkins in C Block, created a volatile situation. Miller was faced with a choice: allow the affair to be exposed, or find a way to prevent it. In that moment of intense pressure, trapped within the confines of the prison he patrolled, he made a fatal decision. The motivation for entering Jenkins' cell, now illuminated by the recovered communications, became horrifyingly clear: desperation driven by the impending ruin of his life. The text message from the woman outside the prison walls, the catalyst for the night's events, arrived at 10:14 p.m. Officer Miller, on duty in Block C, received it while ostensibly conducting his rounds. The content of that message, demanding an immediate end to his relationship with Jenkins and threatening exposure, triggered a cascade of panic. It was this panic that led him to step into the storage closet at 10:15 p.m., away from the immediate line of sight of the main corridor camera, to fully read and process the ultimatum. The seconds he spent in that closet, bathed in the glow of his phone screen, were seconds during which his life appeared to be collapsing. When he emerged, his demeanor, as captured by the surveillance footage, was subtly altered. The calm professional exterior was strained. He knew he had limited time to act. His immediate target was Thomas Jenkins, the man whose existence was the source of the imminent threat. The need to prevent Jenkins from confirming the affair, from speaking to anyone about it, became paramount. It was a desperate, immediate perceived necessity born out of fear and the need for self-preservation. However warped that perception was in the moment. At 10:20 p.m., Officer Miller approached cell C-21-4. The exchange at the door, initially muffled on the audio, involved Miller attempting to persuade or coerce Jenkins into silence. Investigators later pieced together the likely content of this brief conversation, based on Miller's statements. After his confession and analysis of his state of mind, Miller likely told Jenkins about the impending exposure and demanded that Jenkins deny the affair if questioned, perhaps even suggesting Jenkins harm himself to make the problem disappear. Jenkins, according to later inferences from inmates who knew him, was not a confrontational individual, but the thought of self-harm or being involved in covering up an affair that could ruin his life was likely met with resistance. The audio analysis, though imperfect, suggested Jenkins' voice became increasingly loud and panicked. He likely refused to cooperate with Miller's desperate plan. This refusal, captured in those brief moments at the cell door, sealed his fate. Miller, cornered and panicked, saw Jenkins' refusal not just as defiance, but as a guarantee of his own imminent ruin. The decision to unlock the cell door at 10:20 p.m., captured on surveillance footage, was not a planned, calculated murder. It was an impulsive act of desperation. Faced with Jenkins' refusal, and the ticking clock of the outside threat, Miller made a split-second decision to gain physical control over Jenkins, to force his compliance or silence him permanently. He unlocked the door and entered the cell. What happened inside, though partially obscured, was a direct result of the confrontation that began at the door. The struggle visible on the video and audible on the muffled audio was Miller attempting to subdue Jenkins. The use of strangulation, evidenced by the ligature marks, was likely an improvised method, using whatever was immediately available within the cell, perhaps a piece of bedding or clothing. The violence was quick, brutal, and final. In less than 3 minutes, Thomas Jenkins was dead, killed by the very person who was sworn to protect him, all to prevent the exposure of a secret affair initiated by that same officer. The chilling clinical reality is that the murder was a direct, albeit desperate response to a personal crisis, intersecting lethally with professional misconduct. After killing Thomas Jenkins, Officer Miller's primary objective was to conceal his involvement and make the death appear to be anything but a homicide by a correctional officer. The surveillance footage captured him relocking the cell door from the outside at 10. This action was critical to his attempted cover-up. A locked cell door from the outside strongly suggested that no unauthorized person had entered or left the cell. It was intended to point the investigation towards suicide or perhaps an internal issue between inmates that somehow resulted in a death after lockdown, a scenario complicated by the locked door. Miller then resumed his rounds, attempting to project an air of normalcy, interacting with other officers, and completing his shift as usual. He meticulously logged his activities, ensuring the official record showed nothing out of the ordinary. He relied on the locked door and the assumption that a death within a locked cell would be viewed primarily through the lens of inmate behavior. He underestimated the thoroughness of the investigation, particularly the forensic examination, and critically the silent, unwavering testimony of the surveillance cameras. The camera footage, capturing his unauthorized actions and his agitated state before and after entering the cell, would ultimately dismantle his carefully constructed facade of innocence. The initial forensic examination of Thomas Jenkins's body and the cell confirmed the presence of ligature marks on his neck, indicating strangulation. Crucially, the angle and type of marks were inconsistent with self-infliction. The medical examiner's report, later presented in court, concluded that the cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation by ligature, ruling it a homicide. The time of death was estimated to be between 10:20 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. on October 17th, aligning perfectly with the time frame Officer Miller was captured on surveillance entering and exiting Jenkins' cell. Further forensic analysis of the cell turned up trace evidence that corroborated Miller's presence in the struggle, although Miller's attempts to clean up were evident. His uniform was also forensically examined, yielding trace fibers and minute biological material, linking him to the scene and the victim. Each piece of forensic evidence, gathered meticulously by the state police, built upon the foundation laid by the surveillance footage. The physical evidence inside the cell told a story that the locked door was meant to hide, the story of a struggle, a killing, and a desperate attempt at concealment. The confluence of video evidence, personal communications, and forensic findings created an undeniable case. The psychological profile that emerged of Officer David Miller was complex and disturbing. On the surface, he was a dedicated public servant, a 10-year veteran with a clean record, respected by colleagues. Beneath this facade lay a pattern of deceit and risk-taking fueled by a desire for relationships that violated ethical and legal boundaries. The secret affair with Thomas Jenkins was not an isolated incident. but part of a hidden life where personal desires superseded professional integrity. The relationship with the woman outside the prison walls added another layer of complexity, creating a triangle of secrecy that proved fatal. Miller's actions on the night of October 17th were not those of a calculating killer, but of a man in a state of profound panic, making a series of escalating, desperate choices to prevent exposure. The murder was an act of ultimate desperation, a horrifying manifestation of his fear of losing everything: his job, his reputation, potentially his freedom, if his secret life was revealed. His subsequent attempt to cover up the crime by locking the cell and maintaining a normal demeanor demonstrates a chilling level of detachment born from panic and self-preservation instincts taking over. The contrast between the professional officer on camera for years and the man revealed by the investigation was stark and profoundly unsettling. The legal process moved swiftly following Officer Miller's confession, which came after hours of interrogation during which he was presented with the irrefutable video evidence, the phone records detailing the affairs, and initial forensic findings. His confession was not a full admission of cold-blooded murder, but rather a narrative of panic, confrontation, and an impulsive act resulting from the threat of exposure. He described Jenkins's refusal to cooperate, and his own sudden, overwhelming fear. He admitted to using something in the cell to silence Jenkins, but struggled to articulate a clear intent to kill beforehand, instead framing it as a desperate struggle for control that ended fatally. Despite his attempt to portray the act as less than premeditated murder, the evidence of his unauthorized entry into the locked cell with Jenkins, his prior communications with both Jenkins and the woman outside, and the method of killing all pointed towards a deliberate if desperate act of homicide. The prosecution would argue that while the exact moment of deciding to kill might have been impulsive, the act of entering the cell with the intent to silence Jenkins, knowing the potential consequences, constituted the necessary intent for a murder charge. The case hinged on demonstrating the direct link between the secret affairs, the threat of exposure, and the fatal confrontation in cell. The case against Officer David Miller went to trial in the Superior Court of Oak Haven County, Indiana. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the convergence of evidence: the surveillance footage as the unimpeachable record of events on the night of October, the contents of Miller's phone detailing his secret affairs, and the specific ultimatum received minutes before the killing, and the forensic evidence from cell C-21-4, and Jenkins' body confirming strangulation as the cause of death. The prosecution presented the timeline of Miller's actions, contrasting his routine professional logs with the shocking reality captured by the cameras. They argued that the secret affair with Jenkins, and the impending exposure of that affair by the woman outside the prison, provided a clear, powerful motive for Miller to silence Jenkins permanently. The defense attempted to argue that the death was not premeditated murder, but a tragic accident, resulting from a struggle that ensued when Miller entered the cell during a confrontation. They portrayed Miller as a man overwhelmed by personal pressures, acting impulsively in a moment of panic. However, the cold facts presented by the prosecution were difficult to overcome. The image of Officer Miller unlocking and entering a locked cell during lockdown, alone, minutes after receiving a devastating message, was a powerful narrative supported by hard evidence. Witness testimony in the trial included officers who worked with Miller, describing his outwardly professional demeanor. The woman involved in the relationship outside the prison also testified, corroborating the threatening ultimatum she sent to Miller just before the murder. Crucially, state police investigators and forensic analysts provided detailed testimony explaining the surveillance footage, the timeline of events, the contents of Miller's phone, and the findings from the crime scene and autopsy. The medical examiner described the nature of the ligature marks and the cause of death, definitively ruling it a homicide. The defense called character witnesses, but their testimony could not erase the damning evidence presented by the state. Excerpts from Miller's phone communications with both Jenkins and the woman outside the prison were read into the record, painting a vivid picture of his double life and the pressures he faced. The court proceedings laid bare the hidden world that existed beneath the surface of routine prison life, demonstrating how personal secrets could tragically and violently intersect with professional responsibilities within a highly controlled environment. The courtroom became a space where the clinical details of forensic science and the raw reality of human desperation converged. During the trial, the surveillance footage from Block C on the night of October 17th was played repeatedly for the jury. It became the silent, central witness. Jurors watched Officer Miller enter the storage closet, glance furtively around, and emerge with a changed demeanor. They watched him approach cell C-21-4, the brief, agitated conversation at the door, the sound of the key, the door opening, the obscured struggle inside, and Miller emerging moments later, visibly distressed, before quickly relocking the cell. The moments captured by the camera were replayed in slow motion, analyzed and discussed. The footage of Miller locking the cell door from the outside was particularly impactful. It was a deliberate action intended to conceal his involvement, an attempt to create a scene that suggested something other than a homicide by a staff member. The camera feed, initially just routine security documentation, had transformed into the most critical piece of evidence, providing an objective record of the sequence of events that led directly to Thomas Jenkins' death. Its dispassionate perspective offered no judgment, only facts. Facts that powerfully contradicted Miller's initial denials and complicated his later narrative of a simple struggle. The footage served as a constant reminder of the undeniable truth of that night. Ultimately, faced with the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, including the surveillance footage, the phone records detailing the affairs and ultimatum, and the forensic findings, Officer David Miller was found guilty of murder. The jury rejected the defense's argument that it was a lesser form of homicide, concluding that his actions, while perhaps driven by panic, met the legal threshold for murder, due to the intent to silence Jenkins and the deliberate act of using strangulation. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the investigation, but left a lasting sense of shock and devastation within the community and the correctional facility itself. A correctional officer, a figure of authority and presumed trustworthiness, had not only engaged in gross misconduct through a secret affair with an inmate, but had committed murder to prevent that misconduct from being exposed. The institution designed to contain and rehabilitate inmates had become the setting for a fatal act committed by one of its own custodians. The trial process, while bringing justice for Thomas Jenkins' death, also served as a stark and public revelation of the hidden vulnerabilities and dangerous potential when personal failures intersect catastrophically with public trust and authority within a confined and controlled environment. The sentence for Officer David Miller was significant, reflecting the severity of the crime and the profound breach of trust. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term in a different correctional facility, ironically trading his role as a custodian for that of an inmate. The community of Oakhaven and the staff at Elmwood Correctional Facility grappled with the aftermath. For the officers who worked alongside Miller, there was a sense of betrayal and disbelief. The man they thought they knew had been living a lie that cost a life. For the inmates at Elmwood, the murder of Thomas Jenkins by a correctional officer underscored the inherent power imbalance within the prison system and eroded trust in the authority figures meant to ensure their safety. The incident led to internal reviews of security protocols, staff screening procedures, and monitoring of staff conduct, particularly regarding personal devices and relationships with inmates. While procedural changes could be implemented, the deeper impact on trust and morale within the facility was profound and long-lasting. The sterile corridors of Elmwood, once simply the backdrop of routine, were forever marked by the memory of the violence that transpired in cell C-21-4 and the devastating secret that led to it. The family of Thomas Jenkins endured unimaginable pain and grief. They had received news of his death while he was in state custody, expecting him to be safe within the confines of the system. The subsequent revelation that he had been murdered by a correctional officer, and that the motive was a secret affair with that officer, added layers of shock, anger, and complex sorrow. For them, Jenkins was not just an inmate. He was a son, a brother, a father, whose life was taken away not by external violence, but by the internal failings and desperate actions of someone meant to be a figure of authority and safety. The trial provided answers to the brutal facts of how and why he died, but it could not restore their loss or fully comprehend the circumstances. They were left to navigate their grief in the public eye, forever linked to the sensational details of the case. The legal proceedings concluded, the sentence was handed down, and the news cycles moved on, but the quiet devastation for Jenkins' family remained. A private tragedy born from public failure, and a hidden deadly secret. The silence that followed the verdict was heavy, a reminder of the irreparable damage caused by a single act of desperation and deceit within the cold, hard reality of the correctional system. The story of Thomas Jenkins became a stark example of how easily lines can be crossed and trust broken, with fatal consequences within the invisible walls of a prison and the hidden corners of a human heart.